Hello and welcome to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck and I get to talk about history. This has been a history walk like few others. I was at a birthday party and last week met another guest and talked about Better Life Television. And he said, I know about that. I just want you to meet my new friend. You are?
Steve Porter.
Steve, we're going to talk a bunch about communications. That's your thing, isn't it?
That's right. From the beginning of time since I can remember.
Now, where was it that you began this time?
Well, I was born in Berkeley and grew up in El Cerrito, the San Francisco Bay Area. And early on, found an interest in electricity, which led to electronics, which led to radio communications, and in this case, television related somewhat.
So this is not your first time here, but you've been here technically.
Right. I've been into the studio a couple of times in the past when Better Life was just starting up in Grants Pass. Since I had technical expertise on radio communications facilities, radio towers in the mountains around here, and have the ability to climb them and install antennas, I was sought out to give you folks a hand to start up.
Oh, and this you worked with?
I worked with Delmer Wagner.
And that's really back in the beginnings of Better Life TV.
Yes, it was the beginnings. He knew where we wanted to go, we being BLTV in this case, but didn't have the insight to antennas, brackets, coaxial cable, climbing, and that was my entire career. And my shop is right up the street, and we got to talking about this, and I was more than happy to take on these jobs and installed your first antennas for you and watched you folks grow ever since.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Now let's talk about you growing. Because where this El Cerrito and Berkeley, we know are, well, they're in East Bay. That's right where Better Life TV is going, is there. So you know the
That's right.
Bridges.
El Cerrito was 90 degrees perpendicular to the bay, or to the slot that the bay exited into the ocean, the Golden Gate Bridge. So every afternoon in the summer, the fog would roll straight across at us, build up, spread out, and, well, famous fog of San Francisco, and in this case, the East Bay.
I didn't know that. Now, tell me about your interest in electronics. Because there was a little story about Christmas lights that just boggled my mind. He has a collection of Christmas lights, vintage when?
Going back to 1920s, when they really became popular. Manufacturing was to the degree they could do it affordably and people would get them. The very first ones came with a screw-in socket at the end because the only access to electricity would have been for a light bulb. There were no real plugs because there were no real appliances. So the early sets had a screw-in base. I don't have one of those yet, but my son and I really enjoyed collecting Christmas lights early on because it's what helped get me into the profession I'm in now, and it was fun for he and I to have something together to do. So we collected those as well. We've got a couple of trunks full of vintage things. But the Christmas light is what started my interest. When I learned you could plug things in, like the Christmas light, I was interested in plugging things in ever since. Well, electricity led to electronics, and well, here I am. But it started with the Christmas light.
So your mother allowed this?
Not only allowed, but I don't want to say promoted, but encouraged. Sure, they would buy me light sets, and I had a little tree in my room, and in the old days when one light bulb went out, they all went out. Well, it was a challenge to find which one it was. And then, which one? They were in series. And then when I was able to be allowed to decorate a tree out in front, a live tree, I thought that was pretty good, because when you got to plug that in, boom, there it was. And then when they allowed me to decorate the house, getting up on a ladder and such to be trusted, you know, safety and such, it evolved from there, but it did indeed start with the Christmas light.
Now we're talking 5-year-old, 8-year-old?
Probably 6. I know that I hooked up batteries and microphones out of a telephone and speakers out of a radio when I had to be 6, 7, or 8, because I've seen old pictures that my family took. And later in life, I saw them and went, there's those wires running in the back. That was my little one-way intercom. So it's 6, 7, some odd years old.
So intercom, communication, you brought a cute picture here of communication progress.
Oh, right. I don't know where that is.
Right here.
You do. Good.
I sure do. What's the story?
Well, in explaining the history of communications, I like to start by reminding people that there were smoke signals. I don't know much about them. And we remember hearing about the carrier pigeon. And then came the telegraph, then came radio, then came satellites, and then ultimately fiber optics and such. But in the industry for which I'm involved with, this was kind of some promotional material. And I thought that was so cute that I had it hanging up in my shop for a long time. Today I thought I would bring it. And I actually raised pigeons for a while as a young kid, and that's what caught my eye as well.
Raising pigeons for carrier pigeon?
So that you could take them away from home and let them fly back, and as pets, if you will, to care for them. They would sit out on the telephone poles out in front of the house. And I think I enjoyed their sense of freedom. They could just be there and do what they wanted, which I guess was in my blood all along, the sense of freedom, which ties me into the field work that I've been doing for most of my life, as well as, you know, backpacking, which is a sense of freedom as well. So I guess it kind of started early.
Yeah, well, he told me a story about Mom would see him hop on his bicycle. Why don't you tell about,
Going up
is
to the
that
hills.
in Berkeley?
Okay. Well, what started what continued my interest in radio communications would have been radio towers up in the mountains. They're always up in the hills because radio waves are pretty much line of sight. Well, if you're on a major mountain, you can see everywhere. Well, so would the waves carry. So I'd hop on my bicycle and travel up into the El Cerrito Berkeley Hills up above Tilden Park into what's called Vollmer Peak and Grizzly Peak. Those were two communications facilities. It took a long time to get there, several hours. The Berkeley Hills were quite steep. We would look at the antennas, the towers, the buildings, and just be intrigued by what might be in there. And what do they do? How do they work? And as a matter of fact, we had a beautiful view of the entire Bay Area to the west. Off the backside to the east was Mount Diablo, and on a clear day, you could almost see the Sierras. So it was quite the adventure, but we went up there because of the communications. Eventually, we'd go home and perhaps get home a little late, tired and hungry, and my parents would say, well, where have you been all this time? And I explained to them, we made it to the radio communications tower and all that. They thought that was pretty good. And so they continued to encourage and give me opportunity to evolve with radio and such, bought me my first CB radio, or a shortwave radio for that matter, so I could sit home. And by that time, I was getting into the 6th grade, a little bit older, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. But
So there was no cat's whiskers and
no,
razor blades. You're
no,
too young for that.
Yeah, that was too old school and really didn't do too much for me.
But you built?
I'm old enough to have been young enough when tubes were around. So you asked me building things. Absolutely. What a thrill it was to put tubes together, to drill out the chassis, to mount a tube socket, solder the wires together, build power supplies, build transmitters. We entered them in science projects like in the 8th grade and such. But that would have been the beginning of ham radio, where you could build your own transmitters. Often you would buy your receiver, and we would listen to shortwave endlessly, worldwide broadcast, and on it went.
Well,
the building was very exciting back in the day.
Oh, yeah. What's your call?
WA6YSM. I never changed it to a 7 call up here. So that's what it is.
Well,
And I didn't become a ham until I was like 21 years old.
Well, I was a ham when I was 21, too, and that was in Seattle. I married a ham, and you just know you're going to join them, right?
Well, that's right. It's, it could be a technical thing, as well as a social thing, as well as a serve the public. In wartime, a lot of ham radio people handled a lot of traffic to get our military personnel in communications with their family back home through phone patches. Even to this day, ham radio serves a wonderful purpose all across the world. Even in Josephine County, if there's a disaster, there's a full group of ham radios under the Josephine County Emergency Services Group with repeaters all around, ready to go back up and help the sheriff's department.
And when the earthquake hit San Francisco, we all grabbed our radios and went to work.
That's right.
Doug went up the hill and miles away and worked in one facility, and I worked in the power company just as backup, because we were without power for a long time. Anyway, you've tell me, you started out with the mountains that you were going up in
Correct.
the Bay Area.
Correct.
Did you say that you went on to Mount Diablo?
Diablo was a major communications facility, and it also had great views of 13 counties, as well as seeing the Sierras from there. So we thought, well, we've made it to Volmer Peak. Let's now go to Diablo. So we knew it would take so long that we went with food and a sleeping bag on the back of our bicycle. So up and over the hills, through Lafayette and Orinda and Walnut Creek, and ultimately up to the top of Diablo. Stayed probably 2 hours looking at the communications facilities and the view, and then finding a place down further that had some rock caves, and we slept in those. And ultimately we made it back. But we left on a Saturday morning, we were back by Sunday night. But the drive there was mountains and the communications aspect of it. The big radio towers, they were
When you say
fascinating.
the drive, you're not talking about a car, you're talking about internal motivation, right?
Internal motivation. We're talking probably, well, I might have had a Peugeot bicycle by then as opposed to a Schwinn Varsity, but it was a 10-speed bicycle.
Well, and to think that we are now in San Francisco going to Los Angeles with this Better Life TV signal. If you'd have asked this kid from Southern Oregon, are you going to be able to be seen in Germany or Africa? I'd have said, no way. But as a volunteer here, it's going. It started out one little area.
Correct. BLTV started as one transmitter on Mount Bluey, of which I hung the antenna. I did not own the radio site, somebody else did, but I do own 7 of them in the area, and you have things to this day in some of my other facilities. But as far as the ability to get signals around the world, the efficiency of that, the cost of that is what has allowed you to do that. In the old days, television networks had to rely on microwave signals. In the old days, the 60s, it would have been AT&T Long Lines division that had microwave hops north, south, east, and west. Hollywood, New York, big production facilities for television. They had to, and carried the telephone calls that help commerce in this country, run business to make our country great. AT&T, they had to have repeaters every 40 to 60 miles to get them across without fading out. And yeah, things just continued to evolve from there. I even have this, let me take a minute and do this show and tell here. All right, talk about getting your signals around the world. Here's a 300 pair phone cable. So full of copper, which is a resource of our earth, which we need to be careful about. And it was 300, that's all you could do, 300 telephone calls.
You mean
weighs
I could count these?
That's right, and there's a color code in there so you could see what they are. And it weighs a lot per foot, but that was 300 calls. Then they went to coaxial cable, which could handle about maybe 1,200 to 2,400 phone calls. And this is actually buried along Highway 5, and it had to have a relay station every 4 to 6 miles. Those block buildings still exist. There's one right up here at our intersection. There's one in Sunny Valley, et cetera. So as things evolved, ultimately, and this is what I want to share with people because they have no clue often, this is a fiber optic cable. And most people haven't seen the fiber itself, but here is, you won't be able to see them. I'll spread them out and maybe put some coloration behind it. But there's 10 fibers the size of my hair in there. Each fiber can hold terabits of data, which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of phone calls. In this cable.
You mean when I talk, let's say I call San Francisco, and my voice, my intelligence, my whatever, is transmitted on,
Absolutely.
not on one of these, but along with dozens of other.
Hundreds of thousands, hundreds and hundreds of thousands simultaneously, as well as internet traffic, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, in this cable, there's 10 fibers per group, and there are 8 groups in there. So there's 80 fibers in that. That could be strung along Pacific Power or high voltage lines from state to state. It could be buried under right-of-ways along with gas lines and utilities along Highway 5. They can go along railroad right-of-ways, and they all do. They're crisscrossing the country. They're going under the ocean.
Under the ocean is cable. We hear about cable.
The transatlantic cable, et cetera, Yeah, we go from out of Bandon here in Oregon is a big land termination. From there, It goes to Hawaii, to Japan, and then to the Asian mainland. Matter of fact, this cable, I was able to get it because of a decommissioned site. And this specific cable up around Myrtle Creek separated some fibers, went to Bandon, and ultimately ended up Japan. So there was actually physical connections of this cable, which started in Sacramento. And then another hop was to Seattle. Anyway, but that's fiber. That's what it's done for us today.
I feel like I've been going to school, folks. This is about television. And not only television, but
the world as we know it, internet, data, everything is fiber these days. All this hair and stuff is just an insulator. But here would be the bundles color-coded of 8 with 10 in each one of these 8.
Oh, let's talk color-coded. That's an interesting word. You're saying if it's red,
If it's red at that end, it's red at that end. So they know which ones they are. So if they were to say, well, take the red bundle and use the green one within it, then they know what they've got going on.
The little green one here.
Right, very little, size of a hair. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands, terabits worth of information, which is 1,000,000 gigabits. And you hear gigabit anymore. Oh, I can get 24 gig, 100 gig hard drive. Well, there's terabits.
So
transporting at the speed of light.
Introducing us to language that we're not used to, giga, tera.
Computer people use it.
Yeah, but we're not computer people.
Well, there you go. I'm not really either.
But we've moved from the crank telephone to this little tiny
Cell phones.
that I just called Delmer Wagner on
That's right.
to say, hey, Delmer, your buddy's going to be on TV with me.
Who would have ever thought that you could hold in your hand a device that you can go anywhere in the world and do anything you need with it, including pictures? When I first heard digital was coming, I grew up in an analog world. What could you possibly do with zeros and ones? Who'd have thought you could do everything? Pictures, voice, text, data, paint.
Now you're introducing us to another language. All communication is
anymore is basically a stream of zeros and ones. And if you can send them fast enough and package them as groups, so this package goes here and this package goes here, you don't even really know what's happening behind the scenes because boom, it's done. But it's all zeros and ones ultimately.
So folks, we're going to school, right? This guy, what do you credit your knowledge?
Well, I was fortunate. I had a very specific interest. And as you know, if somebody is interested in something, either they will be taught it and absorb it or pursue it on their own. It's just what I did. So I took electronics through high school, and then I was able to, I did not want to go to college. I was not overly academically oriented. I was vocational, hands-on. So I was able to go to a 2-year vocational course up in Portland, Oregon, and that taught me a lot about electronics. When that came to a close, I was able to get a job up there putting in the Portland Police communication system. They went out to bid and got a new system, and they needed manpower, labor to do it. Since I knew a lot about this and they needed manpower, I was hired for that. And then after that, I went back to the Bay Area and got a job with General Electric doing 2A radio, which back to the Bay Area, I got to go to all these different mountains. So let me say that. As a kid, I got to go to these mountains. I chose to go to these mountains on a bicycle. Then when I went back to the Bay and got employed, I had a van full of test equipment, the keys to the building, the alarm code to the system with a very significant rate of pay, and we got to go into that very same building once again. Now, living up here, I own them. We own 7 communications buildings, so it's been a lifelong pursuit. From a common interest, day one, well, okay, starting back with the Christmas light. But I've always enjoyed communication, shortwave, CB, ham. It just evolved. I stayed with it. And if somebody stays with it, you might be able to get somewhere, which I have. We've got quite the
now,
company.
Delmer tells me that his mother, Delmer's brother, was also here. She had a room that she never asked to be cleaned up. It was their workroom. She didn't go in and fuss. they could just explore knowledge.
Experiment.
And look at what happened. Better Life TV was just a dream, and people said it wouldn't happen. It couldn't happen. I mean, he lives off the grid, really. He lives on a mountain, and he's saying, you know, this could happen. Communications come from Southern Oregon. It's now happened. So I encourage you moms and dads out there, let those kids dream big dreams, because they might be the next, what? The next inventor, the next creator.
Absolutely. And even if it's something as simple as, say, music, for instance, if they have an interest, that is important for a child to learn on their own how to pursue knowledge and information besides just going to school and maybe not be interested. How good is it going to work if they're not interested?
Right.
But yeah, and I was lucky to be interested, but absolutely. Parents, encourage your kids. If they have an interest, stand behind them.
I was lucky enough to visit his home, and he said, oh, I have the neon lights that were on your father's building. That's a story I just could hardly even believe.
So when we were first visiting, we were talking about early Grants Pass, and you said that your father had an auto dealership just up from my shop. I says, oh, I know that dealership. It was out of business when I came here, but do you remember the big pole with the big neon sign? You said, well, certainly. Well, not only did my son and I collect Christmas lights, but we collect neon tubes off of the signs also. Why, I'm not sure. It was something we could do together. I did that as a kid, so I got to relive through my son. So when they took down that sign, neons were on both sides. They laid the sign flat on one side, destroying all those, but the ones that were up were just there. My son and I went and took them home, and in my son's bedroom on his ceiling is the Mercedes-Benz triangle insignia, but the circumference of the outside of the insignia was so great, we only have 3 of those tubes taking up one wall. And when you heard that, you were just totally amazed. So when you came to my house to learn more about what my interview potential was I took you to my son's room, and how many years has it been since you've seen that sign?
Oh, a long time.
30, 40?
No, 20-some, but I guess we'll have to ask Henry, my brother, because he'd know when that sign came down. It was the tallest sign, I think, between Eugene and the California border when it was up. And of course, it had to be up tall so you could see it from I-5. And then the Mercedes sign had come around, and then the Datsun sign, and that was the family business. And so we meet again on that.
Exactly. Yeah. You were amazed that I had those.
I was fascinated. There's ever so many ways we could go, and I'm going to ask you back for another show so that I can talk about your enthusiasm for nature. But when did you start, I mean, besides bicycling up those mountains, when did you start doing backpacking?
12th grade. Friends of mine were involved with a hiking club at our high school, and they started going out as a group, kind of a sponsored group, to go do this. And that sounded pretty exciting. I didn't get on too much of it then, but I did some. And then what restarted my interest in that was when my son started back in Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts. Cub Scouts, and then he went to Boy Scouts, and they started backpacking again.
Cub Scouts.
So I realized, oh, I've always enjoyed this, and there's no reason I can't continue it. So now for the past probably 10 years, I've made it a point to go out at least once, sometimes several times a year to discover beautiful places. And it's just been so enjoyable. There's nothing so spiritual and physical and mental as being out in the woods in backpacking. We wander around for days, just enjoying it.
Now we're bragging about not only the Pacific Crest Trail, but any trail at
wilderness areas, Desolation Valley, west of Tahoe, Sky Lakes Wilderness in our area here in the Cascades, of course Yosemite, the Trinity Alps in Northern California, preserved wilderness areas worthy of visiting. And backpacking allows you to do that. Eat well, sleep well, every day is an adventure.
And that you did when you were actually a kid.
Well, the backpacking, like I say, started in high school, but going to mountains, which is similar concept, started very, very young. And I hope you continue backpacking, well, till I can't do it so well anymore, which could be a ways out, guaranteed.
Absolutely. And it's pretty exciting. You started this as an avocation. It has moved you into a vocation.
It has raised my children. It has bought my home. It has afforded me a life that I did not expect to be so plentiful. My industry isn't what it once was, two-way radio communications. Cell phone took a lot of place of mobile phone and paging, but there still is a need for what I do. Police, fire, ambulance, power utilities, transportation, school buses, on, need communications.
And I walk into his shop today, and it looks like a garage. It really has that feeling of early electronic tinker.
Still.
In fact, I think you have an overhead door, don't you, like a garage?
Well, right, and that's so we can pull in vehicles to repair the radios or install the radios into various vehicles.
Well, I thank you so much for walking me through the progress from smoke signals.
Right, through the pigeon, through telegraph, radio, satellite, and ultimately fiber optics, which covers our world and that we take for granted. Every day we just take it for granted, but somebody has to do it. I'm just one of so many people keeping it all running. Snowshoes, snowmobiles, snowcats, ice, keep it going.
Thank you so much.
Well, I enjoyed the opportunity to share it.
Steve, we welcome you, invite you back, and I'm Bernie Martin Beck, and I get to travel, well, this time to the mountains, and I loved it.